Chapter 9. Having lost 7 Cossacks and 7 horses, with 9 of his men wounded, Colonel Bolbotun continued to advance from Pyachersk Square for another few hundred yards until he reached Rezinkovskaya Street, where he stopped. Here, reinforcements had joined the retreating group of cadets, including 1 armoured car. Looking like an ungainly grey tortoise with gun turrets, the armoured car lumbered along Moskovskaya Street, firing 3 rounds from its 3-inch gun in the direction of Pyachersk, with a noise like the rustling of dry leaves. Bolbotun quickly dismounted. He ordered the horses to be led off down a side street, and his men, now on foot, to fall back a little way towards Pyachersk Square and take cover. A fitful exchange of fire ensued. Firing the occasional round, the armoured tortoise blocked off Moskovskaya Street, accompanied by some sparse shooting from the end of Suvorovskaya Street, where a detachment who had fallen back from Pyachersk Square, under fire from Bolbotun, had dug themselves into the snow. With them were the reinforcements who had joined them, and who had been obtained as follows. Ring, ring. First Infantry Detachment? Speaking. 2 companies of officers to be sent to Pyachersk immediately. Yes, sir. Ring. The reinforcements reaching Pyachersk included 14 officers, 4 cadets, 1 student, and 1 actor from the miniatures theatre. Alas, 1 thin line of troops on its own was not enough, even when reinforced by an armoured tortoise. There should have been at least 4 such tortoises, and it can be said with certainty that had there been 4 of them, Bolbotun would have been compelled to retreat from Pyachersk. But there weren't 4 of them. There was a reason for this state of affairs. The person who had been appointed to command one of the armoured cars belonging to the hetman's squadron of 4 first-class machines was none other than the famous ensign Mikhail Semyonovich Polyansky, who in May 1917 had been personally awarded the St. George Cross by Alexander Fyodorovich Kerensky. With his dark skin, clean-shaven cheeks and velvety sideboards, Mikhail Semyonovich bore an extraordinary resemblance to Eugene Onegin. His fame had spread throughout the city as soon as he had arrived from St. Petersburg. He became particularly famous in the Ashes to Dust nightclub as a superb reader of his own poem, Drops of Saturn, as well as being an excellent organizer of the Poets Group and chairman of the Magnetic Triolet Poetry Society. Apart from having no equal as an orator, Polyansky was able to drive military as well as civilian vehicles, kept a ballerina from the opera theatre, Musia Ford, together with another lady whose name as a gentleman he never divulged to anybody, and possessed an inordinate amount of money, which he lent on very generous terms to the members of the Magnetic Triolet Society, in addition to all of which he drank white wine, played chemin de fer, bought a painting entitled Venetian Girl Bathing, lived at night on the Khreshchatyk, spent the morning in the Café Bilboquet, the afternoon in his own luxurious room in the city's best hotel, the Continental, the evening in Ashes to Dust, and in the early morning before sunrise he worked on his scholarly article, The Intuitive in Gogol. The hetman's city died 3 hours earlier than it should have done, precisely because on the evening of the 2nd of December 1918, in the Ashes to Dust nightclub, Mikhail Semyonovich Polyansky had declared the following to the committee members of the Magnetic Triolet Society, Stepanov, Sheya, Slonich, and Cheryomshchin. They're all swine, the hetman as well as Petliura, but Petliura, apart from being a swine, is also a Jew-basher. But that's not my main point, which is that I'm bored because I haven't thrown any bombs for ages. After dinner at the Ashes to Dust, paid for by Polyansky, all the committee members left with him. Polyansky was wearing an expensive fur coat with a beaver collar and top hat. They were accompanied by a 5th man, an inebriated individual in a mohair coat. Polyansky knew a thing or two about him. Firstly, that he had syphilis. Secondly, that he had written some atheistic verse which Polyansky, with his excellent literary connections, had arranged to be published in one of the Moscow journals. And thirdly, that he, Rusakov, was the son of a librarian. Under the Khreshchatyk lamplight, the man with syphilis wept into his mohair coat, and, transfixed by the sight of Polyansky's beaver cuffs, said, "Polyansky, you're the strongest person of all in this city, which, just like me, is in the process of rotting away. You're such a special person that you can be forgiven for the fact that you look like Onyegin. Listen, Shpolyansky, it's indecent to look like Onyegin. You're too healthy somehow, but you lack that little worm inside you that all members of the nobility have, and without which you'll never be able to become one of the outstanding figures of our time. Look at me. I'm rotting away, and I'm proud of it. You're too healthy, but you're also tough as steel, and you should, therefore, break through to the top, right to the top. Look, like this. And the man with syphilis demonstrated exactly how it could be done. Grasping the lamp-post, he began winding his way up it, managing somehow to become unusually tall and thin, like a grass snake. A group of prostitutes went by, as pretty as dolls, wearing green, red, black, and white hats. "Hey, look at you, you!" they called out cheerily. "Had one sniff too many, have you?" Far away there was the sound of gunfire, and in the snow blowing about in the lamplight, Shpolyansky's similarity to Onyegin was more striking than ever. "Go to bed," he said to the syphilitic man of steel, averting his head a little so that the other man wouldn't cough into his face. "Go on, go to bed," he repeated, giving the front of the man's mohair coat a shove with the tips of his fingers. As soon as his kid gloves touched the threadbare material, the man's eyes became like glass. They went their separate ways. Mikhail Semyonovitch summoned a cab, shouted instructions to be taken to Maloprovalnaya Street, and left. The man in the mohair coat staggered off to his home in Podol. That night, in the librarian's apartment in Podol, the owner of the mohair coat stood in front of the mirror, stripped to the waist and holding a lit candle. The syphilitic's eyes were dancing about, crazed with fright, his hands were trembling, and his lips quivering like a small child's. Oh my God, this evening has just been so horrible, and I'm so miserable. All right, Shea was with me, but he's healthy. He's not infected. That's why he's happy. Maybe I should go and kill the girl Lelka. But what would be the point of that? Can anyone explain to me what the point would be? Oh, Lord, I'm only 24 and I could have just another 15 years, and I'll be going blind. My legs will be gangrenous. And then nothing but a mouldy, rotten corpse. With his candle held high, he peered into the dust-covered mirror, reflecting his emaciated body and bare chest covered with a faint, blotchy rash. The tears poured down the sick man's cheeks, and his whole body trembled and shook. I should shoot myself, really, but I don't have the willpower. So, you there, standing in the mirror, what would be the point of lying? What would be the point? He took a slender little volume printed on the most execrable grey-coloured paper from the drawer of a small lady's desk. On its cover were the following words in red letters: Phantomists, Futurists, poems by Shpolyansky, B. Friedman, V. Sharkievich, I. Rusakov. Moscow, 1918. Opening page 13, the poor sick man saw the following familiar lines. 4. Rusakov. God's Ravine. Spread out across the sky, heaven's misty ravine, like a bear sucking its paw, divine essence, great Father, great shaggy bear, God. In the ravine, in his lair, strike down the bear, strike down the God. The crimson sound of battle divine has met with a prayer, a curse of mine. Oh my God! The sick man groaned through clenched teeth. Oh my God! He repeated in inconsolable agony. His face distorted with pain, he spat on his poem and hurled the volume on the floor. Then, kneeling down and pressing his forehead to the cold, dusty parquet flooring, he crossed himself several times with nervous little gestures and started to pray. And as he prayed, He raised his eyes up to the dark, cheerless window. "O Lord, forgive me and have mercy on me for writing such vile rubbish, but why have you been so cruel to me? Why? I know you have punished me so harshly. Take a look, if you please, at my skin. I swear to you by all that's holy, by all that's precious on this earth, by the memory of my departed mother, that I have been punished enough. I believe in you. I believe with my heart and soul, with every fibre of my brain. I believe in you and am turning to you, because there is no one on earth who is able to help me. My hope rests on nobody apart from you. Forgive me, and arrange things so that there are medicines that can help me get better. Forgive me for deciding you didn't exist. For if you didn't exist, then I would now simply be a pathetic, mangy dog without any hope. But I am strong only because you exist, and only because I can turn to you at any moment with a prayer for help. And I believe that you will hear my prayer for help, and that you will forgive me and cure me. Oh, Lord, make me better, and forget about that vile rubbish. I wrote it in a fit of insanity when I was drunk under the influence of cocaine. Just don't let me rot, and I swear I will become a new man. Give me strength, and rid me of cocaine, of weakness of will, and above all, of Mikhail Semyonovich Spolyansky." The candle started to gutter, and the room grew cold. Towards morning, the sick man was covered in little goose pimples. In his heart, he felt considerable relief. Meanwhile, Mikhail Spolyansky himself spent the rest of the night on Maloprovalnya Street, in a large room with a low ceiling and an old portrait depicting a prominent pair of rather faded epaulets from the 1840s that had clearly seen better days. Spolyansky was jacketless, in a white zephyr shirt and elegant black waistcoat with a deeply cut front. He sat on a narrow settee, talking to a woman with a pale, smooth complexion. "You know, Yulia, I've finally decided," he said. "I'm going to join the Hetman's armoured squadron, even though he is a swine." At this, the woman, wrapping herself in a grey fluffy shawl and still exhausted from the passionate Onegin's love-making of half an hour earlier, replied, "I'm really sorry that I don't understand and have never been able to understand your decisions." Spolyansky picked up a brandy glass of sweet-scented cognac from the little table in front of the settee and said, "No need to worry about such things." Within 2 days of this conversation, Mikhail Semyonovich had been transformed. In place of his top hat, he wore a flat military cap with an officer's ribbon, while instead of his civilian clothes he had on a short, knee-length sheepskin coat with crumpled khaki epaulets, a pair of gauntlets like Marcel's in Les Huguenots, and leggings. He was covered all over, including even his face, in engine oil and, for some reason, soot. On one occasion, on the 9th of December to be precise, 2 of the armoured cars had taken part in the fighting on the outskirts of the city, and, to give them their due, they had enjoyed considerable success. They had advanced about 12 miles along the main road, and it had only needed a few rounds from their 3-inch guns and machine guns to force Petliura's units to retreat. The enthusiastic, rosy-cheeked Ensign Strashkevich, the commander of the 4th armoured car, had sworn to Spolyansky that, had all 4 armoured cars been deployed at once, then they could have defended the entire city. This had been on the 9th of December, and 2 days later, at twilight on the 11th, a group of men including Stur, Kopilov, some others, gun-layers, 2 drivers and a mechanic, and Spolyansky, the officer on watch, had discussed the position. "You know, my friends," Spolyansky said, "it's essentially a matter of considerable importance to decide whether or not we are doing the right thing in defending this Hetman fellow. In his hands we're nothing but an expensive and dangerous toy which he can use to impose his outlandishly reactionary ideas on the population. Who knows? Perhaps Petliura's struggle against the Hetman is a historical imperative, and a third force will arise out of this struggle that may well prove to be the only possible correct outcome." Those listening to Spolyansky adored him for precisely the same reason for which everyone at the Ashes to Dust nightclub adored him: his exceptional eloquence. "And what would this force be?" Kopylov asked, puffing at his hand-rolled cigarette. Sture, a clever, thick-set man, winked and gestured knowingly towards the northeast. The group talked a little more, and then separated. On the 12th of December, the same group met again for a second conversation behind the vehicle sheds. What they talked about is unknown, but what is known is that the next day, when a group of them, including Sture, Kopylov, and the snub-nosed Petruchin, were on guard duty at the sheds, Spolyansky appeared carrying a large packet wrapped in paper. The sentry, Sture, let him through into the sheds, lit by a reddish glow from a feeble little lamp. Kopylov gave the packet a conspiratorial wink, and asked, "Sugar?" "Uh-huh," Spolyansky answered. With a lamp flashing beside the armoured cars like an eye, an apprehensive Spolyansky and one of the mechanics worked on the cars to prepare them for the following day's excursion. The cause of all this was the piece of paper from the troop commander, Captain Plieshko, ordering all 4 armoured cars to advance on Pyachersk at 8 a.m. on 14th December. The combined efforts of Spolyansky and the mechanic to get the armoured cars ready for battle were to yield somewhat strange results. On the morning of the 14th of December, the 3 cars that had operated perfectly well the day before, the 4th car commanded by Strashkevich had been engaged in fighting, were unable to leave their sheds, as if paralysed. Some alien substance had got into the carburetors, and no one was able to pump it out, no matter how hard they tried. In the dim, early morning twilight, people bustled about with lamps, but to no avail. Captain Plieshko, his face pale, looked around himself like a wolf and demanded a mechanic. But then, disaster after disaster. Firstly, the mechanic had disappeared. It transpired that against all the rules, nobody in the troop knew where he lived. It began to be rumoured that he had suddenly come down with typhus. This was at 8 o'clock, and at 8:30, Captain Plieshko was dealt a second blow. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Ensign Spolyansky, after dealing with the armoured cars, had ridden off to Pyachersk on a motorcycle driven by Sture, and not returned. Instead, Sture came back with a sad story to tell. They had gone as far as Upper Telichka, where Sture had tried in vain to dissuade Spolyansky from embarking on any rash acts. But the latter, known throughout the squadron for his exceptional courage, had left Sture, and armed with a carbine and a hand grenade, had set off alone into the darkness to reconnoitre the railway line. Hearing shooting, Sture was convinced that Spolyansky had come up against the enemy's forward troops, who had now advanced as far as Telichka, and had been killed by superior forces. Although Spolyansky had ordered Sture to wait there for him for no more than an hour, Sture stayed there in fact for double that time. He then returned to his squadron to avoid putting himself and military motorcycle number 8175 into any further danger. When he heard Sture's account of events, Captain Plieshko turned an even whiter shade of pale. The telephone trilled incessantly, with calls from the hetmans and General Kartuzov's headquarters requesting that armoured cars reinforce this or that position. When, at 9 o'clock, the enthusiastic, rosy-cheeked Strashkevich returned with his armoured car from engaging the enemy, some of the colour in his cheeks transferred itself to the squadron commander's own face. The enthusiastic young man had taken his car as far as Pyachersk, where, as has already been related, he had blockaded Suvorovskaya Street. By 10 o'clock, however, Plieshko's pallor had returned to his cheeks. This time, to stay. 2 gun layers, 2 drivers, and 1 machine gunner had vanished into thin air. All attempts to get the armoured cars moving again proved unsuccessful. And Sture, after riding off on the motorcycle on Captain Plieshko's orders, had not returned to base. As for the motorcycle itself, that didn't come back either, for the obvious reason that it couldn't have returned on its own. The shrill telephone calls started to become more threatening. The longer the day went on, the more calamitous the squadron's situation became. 2 artillerymen, Duvan and Maltsev, disappeared, together with another couple of machine gunners. The cars themselves looked weirdly abandoned, with nothing but a few screws, wrenches, and buckets lying on the ground. And then, at midday, the troop commander himself, Captain Plieshko, disappeared. Chapter 10. In a series of unusual and intricate maneuvers, some associated with savage fighting, others the result of telephone calls from headquarters, Colonel Naitours led his troops for 3 whole days through the piled-up snowdrifts on the outskirts of the city, along the stretch from Red Tavern to Serebryanka in the south, and as far as Postvolinsky in the southwest. On the evening of the 14th of December, he brought his troops back to an alleyway in the city, to an abandoned barracks with broken glass in the windows. The troops under Naitours' command were a strange group of men. Everyone who saw them was struck by the fact that they were wearing felt boots. At the beginning of the 3 days there had been about 150 cadets and 3 ensigns. In the first week of December, a swarthy, smooth-shaven artillery officer of medium height with melancholy eyes and wearing the epaulets of a hussar colonel had reported to Major General Blokhin, the commander of the 1st Infantry Detachment. The newcomer introduced himself as Colonel Naitours, formerly commander of the 2nd Squadron of the Belgrade Hussars. Everyone who came across the colonel with his halting gait and fading ribbon of St. George on his threadbare military greatcoat was so struck by the sight of his melancholy eyes that they always listened to what he had to say with the greatest attention. After a short conversation with Nye, Major General Blokhin asked him to form a 2nd Infantry Detachment, requesting that it be ready for action by the 13th of December. And astonishingly, the process of forming the new detachment had been completed by the 10th of December, on which date Colonel Naitours, always economical with words, briefly told Major General Blokhin, who was beset on all sides by trilling telephones, that he, Naitours, together with his cadets, was ready to move out, but only on the understanding that all 150 of his men be supplied with felt boots and fur caps. Otherwise, any fighting would be quite out of the question. Hearing this laconic announcement delivered in Naitours' idiosyncratic Russian, Blokhin willingly wrote out the requisite order for the quartermaster's department, but warned the colonel that he would probably not obtain anything in less than a week, since the headquarters in general and the supply department in particular were in unbelievable chaos and scandalous disorder. Naitours took the requisition order, and tugging at his left moustache, as was his wont, and looking neither to the right nor to the left, ever since he had been wounded in the neck he had been unable to turn his head, needing to move his whole body whenever he wanted to look to the side, walked out of Major General Blokhin's room. On arrival at the detachment's headquarters on Lvovskaya Street, he commandeered 10 cadets, together with their rifles for no apparent reason, and 2 carts, and set off for the supply department. The supply department was situated in a most attractive little detached house on Bulvarno-Kudryavskaya Street. In a cosy little room with a map of Russia and a portrait of Alexandra Fyodorovna on the walls left over from Red Cross times, Colonel Naitours was met by Lieutenant General Makushin, a small, curiously red-faced man in a grey sheepskin sleeveless jacket with a spotlessly clean vest peeping out from under his collar, making him extraordinarily like one of Tsar Alexander II's ministers, Milutin. Putting down the telephone receiver, the general asked Nye in a childish voice sounding like a clay whistle, "What can I do for you, Colonel?" "My detachment wishes to deploy, and I request supply of felt boots and fur caps for 200 men immediately." Said the general, chewing his lips and crumpling Nye's requisition order in his hands. "You must understand, Colonel, that I am unable to supply you with these today, because we are at present making an inventory of our supplies. Please submit your request again in 3 days' time, but note that in any event I will be unable to supply the quantity you are requesting." He placed the order in a prominent place under a paperweight in the form of a naked woman. "Felt boots," Nye repeated in a flat monotone, and his eyes narrowing, he looked down at the soles of his feet. "What did you say?" the general asked, staring at the colonel in astonishment. "Felt boots at once, immediately." "What's this? What are you saying?" By now the general's eyes were bulging out of their sockets. Nye turned to the door. Half opening it, he shouted out into the warm corridor, "Platoon, to me!" The general turned a grey shade of pale, looking from Nye's face down at the telephone receiver, then at the icon of the Virgin Mary in the corner, and then back to Nye's face. There was the sound of thudding, crashing feet in the corridor, followed by a knock on the door. Then the black bayonets and the red bands on the flat caps of a group of Alexeyevsky cadets appeared in the doorway. The general started to get up from his soft armchair. "Never heard anything like this before in my life. This is mutiny." "Sign the requisition order, if you please, Your Excellency," Nye said. "We have no time. We must leave in an hour. The enemy, they say, like my city." "What?" "Rook rivalry," said Nye in a special sepulchral voice. The general, his head sunk in his shoulders, his eyes bulging, pulled the paper out from under the naked woman, and with trembling hands and a spattering of ink, scrawled the word authorized in one corner. Nye took the piece of paper and tucked it up his sleeve. "Quickly, load the felt boots," he ordered the cadets. With a crashing of bayonets, the cadets left the room, leaving behind their dirty footprints on the carpet. Nye, however, stayed where he was. "I will telephone headquarters," the general said, his face a shade of purple, "and immediately institute proceedings to have you court-martialed. Then you'll know what's what." "Just you try," Nye answered, swallowing hard. "Go on, just you try and see what happens." He lowered his hand to the handle of his gun, peeping out from the top of his holster. The general came out in a rash, quite unable to say another word. "You pick up phone, you silly old man, and my gun shoot you in head," Nye said with sudden emotion. "Then you lie on floor." The general sat down in his chair again. His neck was purple and swollen, but his face had resumed its grey pallor. Nye turned on his heels and left the room. For several minutes the general remained seated in his padded leather chair. Then, turning towards the icon, he crossed himself, picked up the telephone receiver, raised it to his ear, and heard the operator's muffled but familiar voice. Suddenly, the strange hussar's melancholy eyes flashed into his mind, and he replaced the receiver and looked out of the window. He saw the cadets busy carrying the grey bundles of felt boots out of the dark entrance to the warehouse. He could also see in the background the totally stunned expression on the face of the quartermaster holding the piece of paper. Nye was standing, his feet wide apart, by one of the two-wheeled carts, looking at the document. The general desultorily picked up the day's newspaper from his desk, opened it, and read the report on the first page. "By the river Irpen there have been clashes with enemy units attempting to force their way through to Sviatoshin." He tossed the newspaper back onto his desk and said out loud, "Why did I ever get involved in all this, damn it?" The door opened, and a captain, the chief quartermaster's assistant, with the appearance of a tailless ferret, entered the room. He looked expressively at the purple folds on the general's neck and said, "Permission to report, sir." "You know what, Vladimir Fyodorovich?" the general interrupted, breathing heavily, his eyes rolling wearily. "I don't feel too good. The onset of something or other. I think I'll go home now, and I would ask you if you would be so kind as to look after things in my absence." "Yes, sir," the ferret answered, a quizzical expression on his face. "But what do you want me to do? The 4th Detachment and the Mounted Engineers are asking for felt boots. Did you agree to 200 pairs?" "Yes, yes," the general replied in a high-pitched voice. "Yes, I did agree to that. I agreed. My decision and my decision alone. They are to be treated as an exception, as they are about to leave for the front line. Yes." The ferret's eyes danced with wonder and curiosity. "But we've only got 400 pairs in total." "What can I do about it? What?" shouted the general hoarsely. "Give birth to some more? Give birth? Is that it? If they ask for boots, then give them to them. Give them to them." 5 minutes later, General Makushin was driven home in a cab. On the night of the 13th to the 14th of December, the barracks on Brest-Litovskaya Alley came to life. In the vast, dirty hall, the electric lights on the walls between the windows came on again. The cadets had spent the day suspended on lamp-posts, connecting various wires. 150 rifles stood on trestles, and the cadets slept side by side on dirty plank beds. Naitours sat at a rickety wooden table, piled with hunks of bread, pots of some sort of congealed liquid, cartridge pouches and cartridge clips, with a multicoloured map of the city spread out in front of him. A small domestic lamp threw a patch of light onto the map, showing the river Dnieper in blue, branching out like a tree. At about 2 o'clock that morning, Nye started to be overcome by sleep. He leant forward several times, sniffing at the map, as if trying to discern something more closely. Then he called out quietly, "Cadet?" "Yes, Colonel, sir," came the response from the door, and a cadet came up to the lamp, his felt boots swishing. "I'm going to lie down now," said Nye. "Wake me in 3 hours. If there is a telephone message, wake Ensign Zhalov, and he must wake me or not, depending on what the message says." But there was no telephone message. Indeed, Nye's detachment remained generally undisturbed that night. The next morning, at dawn, the detachment set off with 3 machine guns and 3 two-wheeled carts, spreading out along the road. The little houses on the outskirts of the city seemed devoid of life, but when they emerged onto the broad stretch of Polytechnic Street, they came across a lot of activity. In the early light of dawn, they caught a glimpse of baggage wagons rattling past them, and of the grey fur caps of troops trudging along. Everything and everybody was heading back into the city, looking a little fearfully at Nye's men as they went by. As it slowly but surely became lighter, the mist hanging over the gardens of the official government dachas and the rutted and potholed road began to lift and disperse. That day, Nye's detachment stayed in the area of Polytechnic Street until 3 o'clock. A cadet from his signals unit had ridden up on a 4th two-wheeled cart with the following penciled note from headquarters: "Maintain defence of Polytechnic Street. Engage enemy on sight." Nye Tours first saw this enemy at 3 o'clock, with the appearance of numerous mounted troops way over to his left on the snow-covered parade ground of a military barracks. These were Kozieleshka's men attempting to come out onto the main road, along which they could penetrate into the heart of the city in accordance with Colonel Tarapiet's plan. In actual fact, right up to the Polytechnic Street area, Kozieleshka had not encountered any resistance at all. He was not so much attacking the city as simply entering it in a broad, triumphant sweep, knowing full well that he was being followed by Colonel Soznenko's regiment of Ukrainian Cossack cavalry, 2 regiments from the Blue Division, a regiment of riflemen from the south, and 6 gun batteries. As soon as the distant dots of horsemen appeared on the parade ground, shrapnel started bursting high in the heavy snow-laden sky, like a flock of cranes. The horsemen formed into a single line that darkened and swelled as they galloped towards Nye Tours. All along the lines of cadets, the snap of rifle bolts could be heard. Nye Tours took out his whistle, gave a piercing whistle, and shouted, "Take aim at cavalry ahead! Lapid fire!" Flashes sparked along the grey lines of cadets as they fired their opening shots at Kozir. Then the sky resounded 3 times as shells hurtled as far as the walls of the Polytechnic, and 3 times Nye Tours' men responded with a thunderous roar. The dark line of horsemen broke up, scattered and disappeared from the road. Meanwhile, a change had been taking place in Nye Tours. Although, as a matter of fact, no one in the detachment had ever seen Nye Tours to be afraid of anything, now it seemed to the cadets that he had become aware of danger. Maybe in the sky, or maybe he'd heard something in the distance. In short, whatever it was, Nye gave the order to retreat back to the city. 1 unit remained, firing deafeningly along the road to cover the others. Then this too started to run back. They ran for about a mile, stumbling along, their boots thudding on the road, until they came to the crossroads marking the intersection with the same Brest-Litovsk alley where they had spent the previous night. The crossing was completely dead, and there wasn't another person in sight. Here, Nye singled out 3 cadets. "At the double, to Porovaya and Bogchakovskaya streets," he ordered the cadets, "and find out where our troops are and what they're doing. If you come across any baggage wagons, carts, or any other means of transport retreating in a disorganized way, seize them. If you meet with resistance, threaten them with weapons, and then, if necessary, shoot them." The cadets disappeared at a run back to the left. Suddenly, they came under fire from somewhere in front. The bullets ricocheted off the walls, and the shooting intensified. 1 cadet collapsed face down on the snow, reddening it with his blood. He was followed by another cadet, who slumped back from his machine gun with a groan. As Nye's men spread out, they poured a rapid, constant hail of fire onto the shadowy groups of the enemy, who seemed to rise out of the ground as if by magic. The wounded cadets were picked up and bandaged. Knots seemed to have formed in Nye's cheekbones. He turned his body more and more often, trying to see what was happening far out on either flank. It was evident, just from the expression on his face, that he was waiting impatiently for the 3 cadets he had sent off into the city. Finally, they arrived at a run, panting like hounds on the chase, breathing with a hoarse whistle. Nye drew himself up, his face darkening. The first cadet ran up to him and stood there in front of him, gasping for breath. "Colonel, there was no sign of any of our troops, not only on Shulyavka, but anywhere at all," the cadet said, catching his breath. "We heard machine gun fire to our rear, and the enemy cavalry is now moving along from the far end of Shulyavka, apparently entering the city." At that instant, the cadet's words were drowned out by Nye's deafening whistle. The 3 carts rumbled into Brest-Litovsk alley, then clattered along it, and from there down Fonani, rolling and swaying in the potholes. The carts were fully loaded with the 2 wounded cadets, 15 other armed and able-bodied men, and all 3 machine guns. Nye Tours turned to face his lines of men, and, in his idiosyncratic accent, gave the cadets a strange order they had never heard before in their lives. Meanwhile, the 28 cadets in the 3rd section of the 1st Infantry Detachment were idling away their time in the somewhat dilapidated but well-heated building of the former army barracks on Lvovskaya Street. The most interesting point about this inactivity was that the cadets' commander was none other than Nikolka Turbin. The detachment's commander, Staff Captain Bezrukov, together with 2 of his officers, both ensigns, had left that morning to go to headquarters, but had not returned. Nikolka, the most senior lance corporal present, was loafing about, now and again going up to look at the telephone. This situation lasted until 3 o'clock. By now, the cadets all had rather bleak expressions. Then, at 3 o'clock, the telephone rang. "Is that the 3rd section?" "Yes." "Put the commander on the telephone." "Who's speaking?" "This is headquarters." "The commander has not returned." "And who are you?" "Lance Corporal Turbin." "Are you the senior person there?" "Yes, I am." "Take your men and start implementing the plan." And Nikolka took his 28 men and led them along the street. Alexei Vasilyevich Turbin slept the sleep of the dead right through to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He woke up suddenly, as if someone had doused him with water, glanced at the little clock on his bedside chair, saw that it was 10 to 2, and started to rush about the room. He tugged on his felt boots and began stuffing things into his pockets, in his haste forgetting first one thing, then another, matches, cigarette case, handkerchief, Browning, and 2 cartridge clips, and tightened the belt on his greatcoat. Then he remembered something else, something that seemed to him to be both shameful and cowardly. Nonetheless, after a moment's hesitation, he went to his desk and took out his civilian doctor's passport. But as he was turning it over in his hands, deciding whether or not to take it, he heard Yelena calling out to him, and he put the passport down on the table and forgot about it. "Listen, Yelena," Turbin said, tugging nervously at his belt. He had a nagging premonition of impending disaster, and he was distinctly unhappy at the thought that Yelena and Anyuta would be remaining alone in the large, empty apartment. "It can't be helped. I have to go. I don't suppose anything will happen to me. The battalion will not be going any farther than the outskirts of the city, and I will be somewhere or other that's safe. And let's pray that God will keep Nikolka safe too. I heard this morning that the situation has worsened a little, but let's hope we'll beat off Petlura. Goodbye. Goodbye." When he'd gone, Yelena walked about the empty sitting room, from the piano with its colourful Faust music still standing open, to the door to Alexei's study, and back again. The parquet floor creaked under her feet. She looked very sad. Standing on the corner of Vladimirskaya Street and his own winding street, Turbin hailed a cab. Sighing gloomily, the cabbie agreed to take him, but only after naming a monstrously inflated price, making it clear he wasn't going to back down. Gritting his teeth, Turbin got into the sleigh, and they set off in the direction of the museum. There was frost everywhere. Alexei felt deeply anxious. As they travelled along, he could hear distant bursts of machine-gun fire coming from the direction of the Polytechnic. It sounded as if they were firing at the railway station. Turbin wondered what this might signify. He had slept through Bolbotun's midday incursion into the city. He turned to look at the pavements. Although there was a sense of confusion and anxiety, there were still quite a few people about.
"Stop! Stop!"
shouted an inebriated voice. "What's the meaning of this?" Turbin asked angrily. The cabbie pulled back on the reins with such force that Turbin was almost thrown onto his knees. An extremely red face could be seen swaying by the shaft, clinging onto the reins and trying to clamber along them to get to the driver's seat. The crumpled epaulettes of an ensign gleamed on his short, tanned coat. From only a couple of feet away, Turbin was almost overcome by the powerful reek of onion and illicit vodka. The ensign was holding a rifle in his unsteady hands.
Turn around,"
said the red-faced drunkard.
"Tell your passenger to get off."
The word passenger suddenly struck him as funny, and he giggled. "What's the meaning of this?" Turbin repeated angrily. "Can't you see who I am? I'm on my way to report for duty. Please let go of the driver. Carry on."
"No, you stay there,"
said the red-faced man menacingly. But then, suddenly, he blinked as he noticed Turbin's epaulettes.
A doctor. I see. In that case, I'll come with you."
"We aren't going your way. Carry on, driver."
"Just a moment. Carry on."
The cabbie, his head sunk into his shoulders, made as if to tug at the reins, but changed his mind and gave the red-faced man a look that was both fearful and dark with anger. But the latter had moved away, his attention caught by the sight of an empty cab. As the empty cab tried unsuccessfully to move off, the man raised his rifle in both hands and threatened the cabbie. The cabbie froze on the spot, and the drunkard shambled towards him, stumbling and hiccuping.
"I knew I shouldn't have agreed to take you, even for 500.
Turbin's cabbie grumbled angrily, whipping his horse.
"If I get shot in the back, where does that get me?"
Turbin maintained a gloomy silence. What a swine, he thought angrily. It's people like him who bring shame on the whole enterprise. The crossroads by the opera house were seething with bustle and activity. 2 cadets were standing in the middle of a tram line guarding a machine gun. One of them was short and obviously frozen, with earmuffs and wearing a black greatcoat. The other was in grey uniform. Crowds of passers-by had gathered in little groups on the pavements like flies, looking with curiosity at the machine gun. At the chemist's on the corner, with the museum in sight, Turbin stopped the cab and paid the driver.
"I need more than that, Your Honour," the cabbie insisted grimly. "If I had known, I wouldn't have agreed to take you. Look what's going on."
"No, that's all you're getting."
"Why have they dragged children into this?"
said a woman standing nearby. Only then did Turbin notice a large group of armed soldiers by the museum, swaying and growing in size. In among the folds of the greatcoats on the pavement, he could dimly make out a number of machine guns. At that moment there was the furious rattle of a machine gun from the direction of Pyachersk. "What nonsense is this now?" wondered Turbin in confusion, and quickening his pace, he crossed the road, making for the museum. "I'm not late, am I? What a disgrace! They might think I've made off somewhere." Crowds of ensigns and cadets, together with a few soldiers, were dashing around excitedly by the entrance to the museum and the broken side gates leading to the Alexandrovsky High School parade ground. The enormous glass windows in the doors shuddered, and the doors groaned as the armed, dishevelled and excited cadets rushed into the circular white museum building with its pediment boasting the following inscription in gold letters, "For the enlightenment of the Russian people." "Oh, my God!" shouted Turbin involuntarily. "They've already gone!" Standing lonely and abandoned, exactly where they had been the day before, the mortars gaped silently at Turbin. "I don't understand a thing. What does it mean?" Without knowing why, Turbin started running across the parade ground towards the mortars. They grew bigger as he approached, looking more and more threatening. And then, suddenly, he noticed the mortar on the end. He stopped, frozen to the spot. Its breech mechanism was missing. He raced back across the parade ground and out again onto the street. Here the crowd had got even bigger. Many people were shouting, and bayonets could be seen poking up above people's heads.
"We have to wait for Kutuzov. That's what we must do,"
boomed someone anxiously. An ensign walked in front of Turbin, carrying a yellow saddle with dangling stirrups.
It's for the Polish Legion.
Yes, but where is it?
God knows.
Everyone into the museum! Come on, into the museum! To the Don!
The ensign suddenly stopped and threw the saddle down on the pavement.
Oh, to hell with it! They can all rot for all I care, he shouted furiously. Those bloody staff officers!
What a catastrophe. Now I understand. That's awful. They must have gone into battle as infantry. Yes, that must be it. Petliura must have got here quicker than expected. There weren't any horses, so they set off with just their rifles without the mortars. Oh my God, I must get to Madame Anjou's quickly. Maybe I'll find out what's going on once I'm there. Surely there'll still be someone there, won't there? Turbin slipped out of all the confusion and ran back towards the opera theatre, ignoring everything around him. A dry gust of wind blew along the asphalt path around the theatre, ruffling the edge of a half-torn poster on the wall of the theatre by the darkened windows of the side entrance. Carmen. Carmen. At last he was at Madame Anjou's. The cannon and the gold epaulettes in the window had gone. A glowing light flickered fitfully in the windows. Was the place on fire? Turbin tried to push open the door. It jangled a little, but didn't open. He knocked cautiously. He knocked again. A dim grey figure appeared momentarily behind the glass door, opened it, and Turbin went inside. Dumbfounded, he stared at the strange figure who was wearing a student's black greatcoat and a moth-eaten civilian cap with ear-flaps pulled down over the crown of his head. The stranger's face seemed somehow familiar, but there was something weirdly disfigured about it. The stove was roaring away, consuming sheets of paper. The floor was littered with paper. After letting Turbin in, the stranger darted to the stove without saying a word and squatted down, the red glow from the fire playing on his face. Is it Malyshev? Yes, it is Colonel Malyshev, Turbin said to himself, recognizing who it was. The colonel had lost his moustache. His upper lip was now blue and clean-shaven. His hands spread out wide, Malyshev scooped up sheets of paper from the floor and put them on the fire. Aha, thought Turbin. What's happening? It's all over, isn't it? He asked dully. Yes, it's all over, the colonel replied laconically. He jumped up and went quickly over to his desk, gave it a searching look, and banged the drawers a few times, pulling them out and putting them back. Then he suddenly bent down, picked up the last lot of sheets of paper from the floor, and stuffed them into the stove. Only then did he turn to Turbin and say calmly and ironically, "Well, we've done our bit of fighting. Enough." He reached inside his coat and hastily pulled out his wallet, examining the documents inside. He then took 2 of them out, tore them in half, and tossed them into the stove. All this time, Turbin was staring at him. This wasn't the Colonel Malyshev that he knew at all. Instead, he saw in front of him the figure of a rather sturdy student, an amateur actor with puffy pinkish-red lips. "Doctor, what are you thinking of?" Malyshev said with a worried tone, pointing at Turbin's epaulettes. "Take them off at once. What are you doing here? Where have you come from? Don't you know anything?" "I was late, Colonel," Turbin began to explain. Malyshev gave him a cheerful grin. Then the smile suddenly disappeared, and he shook his head with an apologetic and anxious expression on his face. "Oh, my God. I was the one who put you in this spot. I was the one who told you to be back at this time. You've been at home all day, haven't you? Well, all right, let's not talk about that now. Let's just say you need to remove your epaulettes immediately, then run off and hide somewhere." "Yes, but tell me what's going on, for goodness sake." "What's going on?" echoed Malyshev with an ironic laugh. "What's going on is that Petliura's already in the city, in Pyechersk, if not already on the Kreshchatik. The city's been taken." Malyshev suddenly grinned again, looking to one side. Then, again unexpectedly, he started talking as if he were the old Malyshev, and not some amateur actor. "Headquarters have betrayed us. We should have dispersed as long ago as this morning, but luckily, thanks to some good people, I was told all about it last night and managed to disband the battalion. Doctor, we haven't got time to waste. Take those epaulets off. But the museum, back there at the museum. Malishev's face darkened. Nothing to do with me, he answered furiously. Not my problem. Nothing's my problem anymore. I was there not long ago, shouting and warning people to disperse. I can't do any more now. I've saved all my own men. I haven't sent them to be slaughtered, and I have saved them from a shameful fate. Malishev suddenly began shouting hysterically. Clearly something had been coming to the boil inside him, which could not be suppressed any longer. Those damned generals! He yelled, clenching his fists and making a threatening gesture. His face had gone purple. From somewhere farther up the street came the crackle of machine-gun fire, and it seemed as if the large house next door was being hit. Malishev gave a start and fell silent. Right, Doctor, get going. Goodbye, just run, but not out into the street. Go out the back way and then through the courtyards. That way's still open. Quickly! He shook the stunned Turbins' hand, turned sharply on his heels, and ran off through the dark gap behind the partitions. Immediately, everything went quiet in the shop. Outside, the machine gun had stopped firing. Now he was alone. The paper in the stove was still alight. Turbin made his way to the door, slowly and listlessly, despite Malishev's exhortations to hurry. He fumbled for the latch and dropped it into the loop. Ignoring what Malishev had said, he took his time over everything he did, moving around on sluggish legs, his mind blurred and apathetic. The paper in the fire was burning out, and the stove's cheerful flames had now become a dull red glow. Immediately, the shop went much darker. In the grey shadows, the shelves clung to the walls. Turbin ran his eyes over them, dimly conscious that Madame Anjou's still smelt of perfume, faintly maybe, but the scent was still definitely there. Turbin's thoughts were milling around in total confusion, and he spent some time in pointless contemplation of the place where the smooth-shaven colonel had disappeared. Then, in the silence, the knot in his brain slowly unravelled, and the most important thread became transparently clear. Petliura was here. Petora, Petora, he repeated dully, grinning for no particular reason. He went up to the mirror that was hanging on the wall between the windows. It was covered with a layer of dust, like muslin. The paper had now all been used up, and the final little red tongue of fire flickered for a moment longer on the floor, and then went out. Everything went dark. Petliura. How ridiculous it all is. The country's now essentially a hopeless cause, Turbin muttered in the darkness. Then he suddenly remembered where he was. What am I standing here dreaming for? They could be here any minute. Then, just like Malishev immediately before his departure, he hurriedly ripped off his epaulets. The threads made a crackling sound as they came away, and he found himself holding 2 tarnished silver stripes from his tunic and 2 green ones from his greatcoat. He looked at them, turning them in his hands and wanting to tuck them away in his pockets as a keepsake. But realizing that this was dangerous, he changed his mind and decided to burn them. There was no lack of combustible material, even though Malishev had burnt every single document. He scooped up an armful of silk scraps from the floor, stuffed them in the stove, and set them alight. Once again, distorted shadows played on the walls and the floor as Madame Anjou's establishment temporarily came to life. The silver stripes warped and buckled in the flames, bubbling as they swelled up, then turned black and shriveled into nothing. At that point, a really serious thought occurred to Turbin. What should he do with the door? Leave it on the latch or not? What if one of the volunteers who had been left behind just like him should come running here looking for shelter? There wouldn't be anywhere to hide otherwise. He unfastened the latch. Then another thought seared through his brain. What about his passport? He clutched at one pocket, then another. Nothing there. So that was it, damn it. He'd left it behind at home. That was awful. What if he were to bump into some of them? He would be wearing a grey greatcoat, and they would ask who he was.
Aha! A doctor, you say? Prove it. How stupidly absent-minded of him. Come on, get a move on, a voice whispered inside him. Wasting no more time thinking, Turbin dashed through into the depths of the shop and, taking the same way out as Malyshev, ran out of the small door into a dark corridor and from there into the yard at the back. Chapter 11. In obedience to the voice on the telephone and following the orders he had been given, Lance Corporal Nikolai Turbin led his group of 28 cadets out onto the streets and right across the city. These orders brought Nikolka and his cadets to a completely empty crossroads. Although the crossroads seemed totally lifeless, there was a lot of gunfire. All around them, in the sky, on the roofs and walls, the crackle of machine gun fire could be heard. These crossroads were clearly where the enemy should have been, for they had been the final destination in the telephone message. But for the moment, there was no enemy in sight, and Nikolka was a little uncertain what he should do now. His cadets, like their commander looking a little pale but not lacking in courage, spread out in a line on the snow-covered street, all except for the machine gunner, Ivashin, who squatted by his weapon on the side of the street. Raising their heads from the ground, the cadets looked warily ahead of them, waiting to see what exactly was about to happen. Their leader, meanwhile, was so engrossed in thought that he seemed to have shrunk and become even paler. He was struck, first of all, by the absence at the crossroads of everything that the voice on the telephone had promised. He was supposed to be reinforcing a group of men from the 3rd Detachment who should have been there, but they weren't, and there was no trace of them at all. Secondly, Nikolka was struck by the fact that the rattle of machine gun fire could be heard not only in front of them, but also to their left, and even, it seemed, behind them. Thirdly, he was afraid of being frightened, and constantly put himself to the test by asking, "Am I afraid?" "No, I am not afraid," his inner voice would reply buoyantly, and feeling proud that the fact of his bravery had been confirmed in this way, Nikolka turned even paler. This pride turned into the thought that, if he were to be killed, then he would be buried to music. It would all be very simple. He imagined a white, silk-lined coffin moving serenely down the street, carrying the body of Lance Corporal Turbin, killed in battle, with a noble expression on his wax-like face. It was a pity that crosses for bravery were no longer awarded, otherwise he would certainly be wearing a cross on his chest, as well as the ribbon of St. George. Peasant women would be standing at the gate and asking, "Who are they burying, my dear?" "Lance Corporal Turbin. Oh, what a handsome man." And then the music. It is good to die in battle, people say, just so long as you don't suffer. Thinking about the music and the medals helped somewhat to compensate for his uncertainty regarding the enemy, an enemy who evidently had not obeyed the voice on the telephone, and who was not going to turn up at all. "We'll wait here," Nikolka said to the cadets, trying to make his voice sound as assured as possible, but without totally succeeding. There was something not quite right about the whole situation, and it had all become a little absurd. Where was the detachment? Where was the enemy? And it was strange that the shooting seemed to be coming from behind them. And so the leader waited with his troops. Suddenly, in a little side street that led from the crossroads to the Brest-Litovsk highway, shots rang out, and grey figures came pouring along the street in headlong flight. They were rushing straight for Nikolka's cadets, their rifles pointing in all directions. "Are we surrounded?" The thought flashed through Nikolka's mind, and he hesitated, not knowing what order to give. But the next moment he was able to make out the gold patches on the shoulders of some of those running towards him, and he realized that they were on his side. The tall, strapping, fur-capped cadets from the Constantine Military Academy, covered in sweat from their exertions, flung themselves down on one knee and fired 2 rounds, their rifle muzzles flashing faintly as they aimed down the street from which they had just emerged. Then they leapt up, flung down their rifles, and dashed off across the crossroads and past Nikolka's men. As they ran, they tore off their epaulets, cartridge pouches and belts, tossing them down onto the flattened snow. As one large, well-built, grey-coated cadet ran past Nikolka, he turned to his men and, gasping for breath, shouted out in a booming voice, "Run! Follow us! Save yourselves if you can!" Shocked at the sight of all this, the line of Nikolka's cadets began to stand up. Nikolka stood still for a moment, totally stupefied. Then, immediately, he took a grip on himself, one thought flashing through his brain like lightning. "This is my chance to become a hero." Then he gave a piercing shout. "Don't dare stand up! Obey my orders!" "What on earth are they doing?" Nikolka said to himself, enraged. When they reached the other side of the crossroads, the 20 or so Constantine Academy cadets, now weaponless, dispersed down Fanani Alley, some of them dashing into the first enormous gateway. The metal gates closed with a thunderous crash, and their boots could be heard clattering up the stairwell. A second group ran into the next gateway. The 5 remaining men continued to run, faster and faster, down Fanani, and disappeared into the distance. Then one more fleeing figure, the final one with faint gold epaulets on his coat, appeared on the crossroads. With a single, sharp-eyed glance, Nikolka instantly recognized the figure of the commander of the second squad of the first detachment, Colonel Naitours. "Colonel!" called out Nikolka, confused and yet at the same time elated. "Your men are fleeing in panic!" At this point, something quite outrageous happened. Naitours ran out onto the trampled snow of the crossroads, his greatcoat tucked up on both sides in the manner of a French infantryman. His battered service cap, held in place by a chin strap, was perched on the back of his head. In his right hand he held a Colt pistol, the open holster dangling and banging on his hip. He had not shaved for some time, and his bristly face bore a grim expression. His eyes were turned inwards, and when he came closer, the zigzag epaulets of a hussar regiment were clearly visible on his shoulders. Naitours ran up to Nikolka, and with one sweep of his free left hand, tore off first Nikolka's left epaulet, and then the right. The waxed, good-quality threads, holding the epaulets in place, snapped off with explosive force. In the case of the right-hand epaulet, taking a piece of Nikolka's greatcoat with them. The movement was so forceful that Nikolka instantly realized just how strong Naitours' hands were. Knocked backwards, Nikolka abruptly sat down on something soft, the something turning out to be the machine-gunner Ivashin, who leapt out from under him with a howl of protest. Then all hell broke loose as the dumbfounded faces of Nikolka's cadets danced around in front of his eyes. Nikolka was able to retain his sanity only because Naitours had acted so precipitately that he was too astonished to have time to do anything else. Turning to the scattered group of cadets, Naitours yelled out an order in his strange, inimitable accent. Nikolka had the irrational feeling that a voice like that could be heard for several miles, and probably throughout the city. "Cadets, listen to me. Tear off your epaulets, cap badges and cartridge pouches, and get rid of your weapons. Go down Fanani, then take the back way to Lazhizhaya Street, and then on to Podor. To Podor. Tear up your identity papers as you go, then scatter and hide, tearing anyone you meet to do the same." Then, waving his pistol in the air, Naitours bawled out at the top of his voice with the force of a cavalry bugle, "Go down Fanani! Only Fanani, not any other way! Get to your homes and go into hiding! The fighting's over! Quickly!" For a few moments the cadets were unable to collect their senses. Then they turned very pale. In front of Nikolka's eyes, Ivashin ripped off his epaulets, flung his cartridge pouches onto the snow, and sent his rifle clattering along the raised verge of the pavement. Within 30 seconds, cartridge pouches and belts, together with someone's tattered service cap, lay abandoned on the crossroads. The cadets started running down Fanani, darting into one or other of the backyards that led out onto Razhizhaya Street. Naitours returned his pistol to its holster with a flourish, ran to the machine gun by the pavement, crouched down beside it, and turned it round so that it faced the way he had come. With his left hand, he sorted out the cartridge belt. Then, from this position, he turned to Nikolka and yelled furiously, "Are you deaf or something? Go on! Run!" A strange, drunken feeling of ecstasy welled up from somewhere inside Nikolka, and his mouth turned instantly dry. "I don't wish to, Colonel," he answered in a matter-of-fact voice, and squatting down on his haunches, grabbed the cartridge belt with both hands and started feeding it into the machine gun. Then, in the distance, farther down the street from which the remaining men of Naitur's detachment had emerged, several figures on horseback appeared. Nikolka and Naitur's could dimly make out that the horses were prancing along skittishly, and that the cavalrymen were holding the grey blades of swords in their hands. Naitur's cocked the trigger and sent a burst of machine-gun fire in their direction, then another, followed by a third, this time prolonged burst. Instantly, bullets started smashing into the roofs of houses on both sides of the street. Some more cavalrymen appeared, but then one of them darted off into a house. Another's horse reared up extraordinarily high, so that it almost reached the first floor, and several cavalrymen disappeared altogether. Then all the rest vanished as well, as if into the ground. Naitur's released the trigger, shook his fist at the sky, and shouted, his eyes blazing, "My poor boys! Those headquarters bastards!" He turned to Nikolka and yelled in a voice that again sounded to Nikolka like a muted cavalry bugle, "Clear off, you idiot! Clear off, I say!" He looked back down the street again, making sure that all the cadets had disappeared. Then, looking along the crossroads to the distant street that ran parallel with the Brest-Litovsk highway, he shouted out in pain and in anger, "Oh, damn it!" Nikolka turned to look in the same direction, and saw far away on Cadet Street, by the unkempt snow-covered boulevard, dark lines of figures moving along, and then falling to the ground. Then, much closer on the corner of Fanani, right above his and Naitur's heads, a sign saying, "Berta Yakovlevna, Prince Metal, Dental Surgeon." The sign resounded with a clang, and somewhere on the other side of the gates, window panes shattered. Nikolka saw chunks of plaster leaping and bouncing along the pavement. He looked questioningly at Naitur's, wondering what the distant figures and the plaster signified. But the colonel reacted strangely, grinning inappropriately, and leaping around on one leg while waving the other in the air, as if dancing a waltz. Then, suddenly, he was lying on the ground at Nikolka's feet. A black fog enveloped Nikolka's mind. Sobbing dryly without any tears, he bent down and tried to lift Naitur's up by his shoulders. Only then did he see the blood trickling through the colonel's left sleeve, and his eyes staring at the sky. "Colonel, sir, Colonel." "Corporal," Naitur's started to say, but then blood poured out of his mouth onto his chin, and his voice began to fade, weakening with every word. "Stop being so damned heroic. I'm dying. Maroplovarnaya Street." He didn't want to explain any further. His lower jaw began to shudder, twitching convulsively 3 times, as if he was suffocating. Then stopped, and the colonel became as heavy as a bag of flour. "So that's how people die, is it?" Nikolka thought. "It can't be. He was alive a moment ago. It seems it's not so terrible to die in battle. I wonder why I haven't been hit." Dent, Urgent. The sign overhead quivered and shook for a second time, and once again there was the sound of glass shattering. Then the idiotic thought passed through Nikolka's confused brain that perhaps the colonel had simply fainted. He tried to pull him up, but to no avail. "Am I afraid?" he asked himself again, and he knew he felt hideously afraid. But why? Why? He wondered. But then he immediately realized that he was afraid because he was desperately sad and totally alone. If only Colonel Naitur's would get back up on his feet, then he wouldn't be afraid at all. But the colonel continued to lie there in front of him, completely motionless, unable to issue any commands, or to be aware of the large red puddle spreading by his sleeve, or of the plaster that was insanely breaking off and crumbling away on the wall ledges. No, Nikolka was afraid, because he was totally alone. There weren't any cavalry galloping by at that moment, but it was clear that everybody was against him, and that he was totally on his own, the last one left. And it was loneliness that drove Nikolka from the crossroads. He crawled along on his stomach, propelling himself by his hands and arms, in the case of his right arm by his elbow, as he was clutching Naitur's Colt pistol in his palm. The fear hit him most strongly when he was a couple of yards from the corner of the street. Any minute now, and I'll be hit in the leg. Then I'll be unable to move, and Petliura's men will come riding up and hack me to pieces with their swords. Terrible to be lying on the ground with people hacking at you. If there are any bullets in Naitor's pistol, I'll fire at them. Just a bit farther. One more push with the arms. And Nikolka found himself round the corner in Fonani Alley. How astonishing! Extraordinarily astonishing I haven't been hit. It's nothing but a miracle. It's the Lord God working miracles, Nikolka thought as he stood up. That's what a miracle is, then. I've experienced one for myself. Notre Dame Cathedral. Victor Hugo. I wonder if anything's happened to Yelena. And what about Alexei? Clearly, once you have your epaulets ripped off, that spells disaster. Nikolka leapt to his feet, up to his neck in snow. He put the Colt in his greatcoat pocket and dashed down the street until he met the first gaping gateway to the right. He ran into the echoing archway and out onto a gloomy, squalid little yard with some red-brick sheds on the right-hand side and a stack of logs on the left. Realizing that the way out was through the middle, he made a dash for it, slipping and sliding, and collided with someone in a sheepskin jacket. He could see him with total clarity. Ginger beard and tiny little eyes, leaking hatred. A snub-nosed Nero in a sheepskin cap. As if taking part in some light-hearted game, the man seized hold of Nikolka with his left arm while grabbing Nikolka's left hand with his other and twisting it behind his back. For several moments, Nikolka was too shocked to move. My God, he's got me. He hates me. One of Petliura's.
Got you, you little rat!
Screeched the ginger-bearded man, pausing to gasp for breath.
Where do you think you're going? Stop!
He yelled.
Stop the cadets! Hold them! Hold them! So you think you can take off your epaulets so that people won't know who you are, do you little rat? Hold them!
Filled from head to toe with an overwhelming sense of rage, Nikolka jerked his body down so abruptly that the belt on the back of his greatcoat snapped. Then he turned and with unnatural force freed himself from the clutches of the ginger-bearded man. Not seeing him for a moment, he turned, and there he was again. He had no weapon. Wasn't even a soldier, just the local caretaker. The rage that had been enveloping Nikolka's brain like a red blanket suddenly disappeared, to be replaced by an extraordinary sense of total control. He grinned like a young wolf, the wind and frost gushing into his hot body. He whipped the pistol from his pocket, thinking, "Let's hope there are some bullets, then I can kill the bastard." Then, when he did speak, his own voice seemed so strange and alien that he didn't recognize it.
"I'll kill you, you little snake!"
he shouted hoarsely, fingering the complex little Colt, and then instantly realized he had forgotten how to fire it. Seeing that Nikolka was armed, the ginger-bearded caretaker fell to his knees in horrified despair, miraculously transforming himself somehow from a Nero into a snake.
"Your Honor!
He wailed. All the same, Nikolka would definitely have fired, had he been able to, but the Colt remained silent. Damn it, no bullets, he thought, his mind whirling. Shielding himself with his hand, the caretaker edged backwards and moved from a kneeling to a squatting position. Then he let out such a wail of anguish that it destroyed Nikolka. Unsure what he could do to close that huge, gaping mouth framed in its copper-coloured beard, and in despair because his pistol had been unable to fire, Nikolka leapt onto the caretaker like a fighting cock and smashed the butt into the man's teeth, risking shooting himself as he did so. In a flash, Nikolka's rage dissipated. The caretaker jumped up and ran off back into the archway through which Nikolka had come. No longer wailing and out of his mind with terror, the caretaker ran off, slipping and stumbling on the ice. He turned once to look back, and Nikolka could see that half of his beard was covered in blood. Then he disappeared. Nikolka dashed off in the opposite direction, past the little brick shed, and towards the gate leading out onto Rossiya Street. There he stopped, overcome by despair. That's it. I'm finished. I'm too late and I'm trapped. And my God, the gun doesn't fire. He shook at the huge bolt and lock, but to no avail. He had to do something. The ginger-headed caretaker had locked the gate as soon as Naitur's cadets had run through onto the street, leaving Nikolka confronting a completely insuperable obstacle in the form of a sheer metal barrier, totally without any footholds. He turned and glanced up at the sky, covered by extraordinarily dense and low-lying clouds, and saw a flimsy black ladder propped on a firewall leading up to the roof of a 4-story building. Perhaps I could climb up that, he thought, and immediately the graphic image of Nat Pinkerton, wearing a yellow jacket with a red mask over his face, clambering up just such a ladder, flashed absurdly through his mind. Nat Pinkerton? America, eh? All right, I'll climb up it, and then what? I'll be sitting on the roof like some idiot, and in the meantime the caretaker will have got hold of a group of Petlura's men. That Nero's sure to give me away. He won't forgive me for smashing his teeth in. And sure enough, he could hear the caretaker desperately shouting for help by the gate into Fonani Alley, and then the clatter of horses' hooves. Nikolka realized what must have happened. Petlura's cavalry had entered the city in a flanking movement, and had already reached Fonani. So that's what Naitours had been shouting about. But there was no going back down Fonani now. These thoughts came to him as he stood unaccountably on the stack of logs piled next to the brick shed, under the wall belonging to the adjacent house. Ripping his trousers and stumbling and falling on the icy logs shifting around under his feet, he made his way to the wall. He looked over the top into an identical yard to the one he was in. The two courtyards were so alike that he expected the ginger Nero in the sheepskin coat to leap out onto him again, but nobody leapt out. With a terrible hollow feeling in his stomach and his side, he sat down on the ground. As he did so, his pistol jerked in his hand, and a deafening shot rang out. At first he was astonished, but then he realized that the safety catch had been on all this time, and that his sudden movement had released it. That's a bit of luck, he thought. But the gate into Rossiya Street here was just like the other one, damn it, locked and impossible to climb. Right then, let's try the next wall. But to his horror, he saw there were no logs by this one. Securing the safety catch, he put the pistol into his pocket. He clambered along a pile of broken bricks, and then started climbing up the sheer face of the wall like a fly, placing his feet into such tiny little nooks and crannies that normally wouldn't have accommodated even a small coin. With torn fingernails and his fingers covered in blood, he clawed his way to the top of the wall. As he lay there on his stomach, he heard, behind him in the first yard, a piercing whistle and Nero's voice, and then in front of him in the third yard, he saw a woman's face, distorted with horror, looking at him from a darkened first-floor window, just for an instant, and then the face was gone. Tumbling off the wall, he landed, as luck would have it, in a fortunately placed snowdrift, but he twisted his neck and felt a sharp pain at the top of his skull. His head ringing and with flashes in his eyes, he ran to the gate. Absolute joy! This gate was locked as well, but that didn't matter. There was an elaborate metal railing on one side. Like a fireman, Nikolka clambered up it and down onto the other side, finding himself in Rossiya Street. He saw that it was completely empty, not a soul about. Just a few moments' rest, to catch my breath, otherwise my heart will burst, he thought, gulping air into his overheated body. Ah yes, my papers. He pulled a wad of dirty, oil-streaked papers out of his jacket pocket and tore them into pieces, scattering them all over the place like snowflakes. Behind him, from the direction of the crossroads where he had left Naitours, a machine gun opened up, to be answered by machine gun and rifle fire coming from in front of him, from the city. So that was it. There was fighting in the city centre, and the city had been taken. Absolute disaster. Still breathing deeply, Nikolka brushed the snow off his body with both hands. What about the pistol? Should he throw that away too? Naitours' pistol? No, not for one moment. He might be able to get through unscathed. They couldn't be everywhere at once, surely. Panting heavily and feeling his legs weakening and giving way under him, Nikolka ran along the empty Rossiya Street and made his way without incident as far as the crossroads at the junction of two streets, Lubachitskaya leading to Podol and Lovskaya curving away towards the city centre. By the side of a pillar he saw a pool of blood and a pile of manure, together with 2 abandoned rifles and a blue student's cap. He hastily took off his fur cap, replacing it with the cap. It seemed rather too small for him, giving him an insolent, devil-may-care, non-military look, like some down-at-heel character who had been slung out of high school. Peering round the corner, he took an anxious glance down Lovskaya Street and saw a distant group of cavalry trotting along with dark blue patches on their fur caps. He could hear the crackle of rifle fire. There was clearly some trouble down there. So he darted down Lubachitskaya Street, where he saw his first live human being, in the form of a woman running along the opposite pavement, a black feathered hat perched on one side of her head, and a grey bag swinging in her hand, from which a cockerel was desperately trying to claw its way out, and screeching with such force that the whole street could hear. "Petura! Petura!" it seemed to be shouting. Carrots were spilling out onto the pavement through a hole in the paper bag the woman was carrying. She was shouting and weeping as she ran, keeping close to the wall. Some well-to-do man whirled past, crossing himself furiously, and shouting, "Oh, Christ Jesus! Volodka! Volodka! Petliura's coming!" At the end of Lubachitskaya Street, there were many people bustling and scurrying about, making quickly for the gates. Someone in a black coat, crazed with fear, dashed up to the gates, inserted his stick into the metal bars, and snapped it in half. Meanwhile, all this time, twilight had been coming on so fast that by now it had already arrived. When Nikolka turned off Lubachitskaya Street onto Volsky Hill, the electric street lamp on the corner lit up and began to hiss faintly. The shutters of a little shop crashed shut, instantly hiding a pile of multicoloured boxes marked soap powder. A cabby took a bend too sharply and crashed into a snowdrift, overturning his sleigh, and started lashing out at his miserable horse with his whip. Nikolka dashed past a 4-story house with 3 entrances, all 3 of which were again and again being flung open. Someone in a sealskin fur collar rushed past Nikolka, yelling at the gate, "Pyotr! Pyotr! Are you out of your mind? Close the gate! Close the gate!" A door slammed shut in one of the entrances, and a woman's voice yelled from the dark staircase inside, "Petliura's coming! Petliura!" The closer Nikolka came to Podol, the safe area that Tours had told him about, the greater the number of people who were dashing and bustling along the streets. But there seemed to be less fear, and not everyone was heading in the same direction as he was. Some were moving towards him. At the very top of the slope leading down to Podol, a young cadet in a grey greatcoat with white epaulets emblazoned with the gold letter V emerged solemnly from the entrance to a grey stone building. He had a button nose, and his eyes darted animatedly from side to side. A large rifle was slung over one shoulder. When the people who were scurrying by caught sight of this armed young man, they scattered in all directions. But the cadet simply stood on the pavement and listened intently to the shooting coming from the upper city, with a knowing, inquisitive expression on his face. His nose twitched, and he began to move off. Nikolka abruptly blocked his way, standing in the middle of the pavement and pressing right up against him. "Get rid of that rifle and hide immediately," he whispered. Alarmed, the cadet shuddered and took a step back, but then he clutched at his rifle threateningly. In a move born of experience, Nikolka pushed and forced the cadet back into the entrance between 2 doorways. "Hide, I tell you," he repeated forcefully. "I'm a cadet. The situation's disastrous. Petliura's taken the city." "What do you mean? How's he taken the city?" the cadet asked, his mouth open, revealing a tooth missing in his left jaw. "That's how," answered Nikolka, pointing in the direction of the upper city. "Do you hear that? That's Petliura's cavalry moving along the streets. I've only just managed to escape myself. Run home, hide your rifle, and warn everyone you see." The cadet froze to the spot in the entrance, speechless. That was how Nikolka left him. He had no time to waste with people who were so slow on the uptake. In Podol, the sense of alarm was less, but there were still plenty of people on the move. Passers-by quickened their step, flinging back their heads to listen, while cooks hurried into entrances and gateways, wrapping themselves in grey shawls. The crackle of machine-gun fire from the upper city was now constant. But at this twilight hour on the 14th of December, nowhere, neither in the distance nor close by, was there the sound of heavy artillery. Nikolka still had a long way to go. By the time he had crossed Podol, the streets had already become shrouded in twilight. The heavily falling snow, its flakes glistening in the lamplight, blanketed the sound of anxious people scurrying along. Here and there through the snow he glimpsed cheerful lights in shop windows, but not everywhere. Some windows had already gone completely dark. The snow was beginning to settle more and more. When Nikolka finally arrived at the bottom of the steep slope of his street, St. Alexei's Hill, and started to walk up it, he came across the following scene by the gateway to number 7. 2 boys in grey knitted jackets and headgear had just tobogganed down from the top of the hill. One of them, as small and round as a ball and plastered with snow from head to foot, was sitting on the ground, roaring with laughter. The other one, slightly older, a thin, serious-looking lad, was untying the knot on his rope. Another lad in a sheepskin coat was standing by the gate, picking his nose. The sound of gunfire intensified, flaring up in various different places above them.
"Hey, Vaska, I really banged my bum back there against a post,"
the younger boy shouted. Look at them tobogganing like that, without a care in the world, thought Nikolka in astonishment, and turned to the lad in the sheepskin coat. Can you please tell me, he asked softly, what that shooting is up there? The lad took his finger out of his nose and said nasally,
"That's our boys giving the officers what for."
Nikolka looked at him mistrustfully, absent-mindedly fingering the pistol in his pocket.
"They're getting their own back on the officers,"
the older boy put in angrily.
"Serves them right. There's only 800 of them in the entire city, and they've behaved like idiots. Petliura's here now, and he's got 1,000,000 men."
He turned and started pulling the toboggan back up the hill. The cream-coloured curtain between the veranda and the small dining room was flung open immediately. The clock ticked on. Tonk, tank. "Is Alexei back?" Nikolka asked Yelena. "No," she replied, and burst into tears. It was dark. The entire apartment was dark, except for a lamp shining in the kitchen where Anyuta was sitting weeping, her elbows propped on the table. She was weeping naturally for Alexei Vasilievich. In Yelena's bedroom, the logs glowed in the fire, spitting out embers through the damper, emitting hot sparks that danced around for a moment on the floor. Having cried her heart out for Alexei, Yelena sat on a little stool, her cheek propped on her fist. Bathed in the red glow of the fire, Nikolka lay on the floor at her feet, his legs spread out like a pair of scissors. This colonel, this Bolbotun, the Shcheglovs had been putting it about that afternoon that he was none other than Grand Duke Mikhail Alexandrovich. Here, in the semi-darkness, in the glow of the fire, there was a general sense of despair. But what was the point of weeping for Alexei? Tears, of course, wouldn't help at all. He had been killed. There was no doubt about it. It was obvious. Nobody was taking any prisoners. The fact that he hadn't come home meant that he had been killed, together with the rest of the battalion. The worst thing of all, so they said, was that Petliura had over 800,000 men, all hand-picked elite troops. We had been betrayed and sent to our deaths. But where had this terrifying army come from? It had appeared seemingly from nowhere, fashioned from the needle-sharp blue twilight air, from the frost and the mist. Mist. Everywhere mist.